I think that this is going to be a fairly long haul where you will have those who, even with Gaddafi out of the picture, are going to hanker after a time where there was stability, there were many beneficiaries from his regime. I think you've got a population in Tripoli, unlike in Benghazi, which is still partially ambivalent.
The Economist.
In London, this is The Economist. It's August the 25th. Over 6 months since Libya's revolution began in the east in Benghazi, rebel troops have at last reached Tripoli. The whereabouts of Libya's leader, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, remain unknown, and fighting continues between his followers and rebel troops in and around the capital. To get a sense of how events are unfolding in Tripoli, and in the longer term what the future might hold for Libya, we spoke to Nicholas Pelham, The Economist's correspondent in Tripoli, and Daniel Serwer, a professor at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. First to Tripoli. Front pages have been dominated this week by images of jubilant rebels thronging through Green Square, taking over Colonel Gaddafi's compound. Nick, you're in Tripoli. What's the atmosphere like there at the moment?
There's still not much traffic on the streets. That's largely because petrol remains in incredibly short supply. A few of the shops have begun to open, but it's still very much a deserted capital. You get a very mixed picture depending on where you are. If you speak to people from Tripoli who joined the rebels, they talk about months of painstaking preparation, of training in farms, of preparing homemade grenades and Molotov cocktails, of buying weapons on the sly, of trying to work with even senior officers within the army to train them. You get a sense that they were also coordinating this with people outside, both in Benghazi and further afield. And you get a picture of a coordinated takeover of Tripoli in which NATO bombardment of Gaddafi's bases combined with a rebel assault coming down from the mountains was backed by a popular uprising on the ground. When you get to other neighborhoods, you get a totally different picture of something which was haphazard, where there was nervousness about what was happening, where there was no real organization, where the population was adapting to the situation, to a very fluid situation as it happened. And I think it's those contrasts, both the sense in which there is an internal constituency in Tripoli, which the National Council can build on, but there's also deep disaffection, deep nervousness about what the future could bring amongst other segments of the population.
The situation that you've been describing in Tripoli sounds like it's very fluid. What do you think are the dangers of this kind of uncertainty continuing?
The longer this sense of unknown continues, the more I think people are going to turn to coping mechanisms of their own. They're going to look to their own neighborhoods, they're going to look to their own families, their extended families, their regional ties and bonds. People are going to start retreating inwards, and it'll become harder and harder to establish central control. It has to be remembered that, although the rebels say that they have captured 95% of the country, Libya is still divided between east and west. Gaddafi's loyalists control a central buffer running all the way from Sit down to Sebha. It's not possible at the moment to drive from east to west, and those logistics are certainly hampering the efforts of those who want to establish a central authority under the National Council.
How important do you think finding Colonel Gaddafi is?
I think that's a critical part of the equation for many Libyans. I don't think it's the only part. They really don't know who's going to take his place. They don't know what's going to fill that vacuum. They don't know who the next government is going to be. They don't know if there's going to be a government. They don't know if the government's going to be able to fill the security vacuum that exists. And of course, whether or not Gaddafi is captured, it's critical to that.
How significant do you think the fear is of retribution and revenge attacks?
I think they were afraid of retribution on multiple fronts. Certainly they've been fed propaganda by the Gaddafi regime for the last 6 months, warning that Al-Qaeda was coming to kill them, warning that there are barbarians from the east who are stooges of Western imperialists who are going to slaughter them. Part of that has been allayed because Libyans in Tripoli can say that they, in many ways, freed themselves, that they were the ones who erected their own barricades. They managed to protect themselves. So certainly they managed to allay that fear of an Eastern takeover, which I think did prevail amongst many people. But they haven't allayed that fear of looting, and they haven't allayed that fear that Gaddafi and his loyalists are still at large. It's not clear where many of the brigades have disappeared to. Did they leave en masse and flee the capital? Are they still in hiding in the city? Can they still continue to wreak havoc? I think these are questions that the population doesn't have an answer for.
I think at the beginning of this week, there was a real sense of elation that we were seeing the final crumbling of the Gaddafi regime. And as the fighting has continued, that has changed somewhat, and there is more of a sense that perhaps we're in the final stage or the final chapter of Gaddafi's rule. How long do you see this stage lasting?
I think that this is going to be a fairly long haul where you will have those who, even with Gaddafi out of the picture, are going to hanker after a time where there was stability. There were many beneficiaries from his regime. I think you've got a population in Tripoli, unlike in Benghazi, which is still partially ambivalent. In Benghazi, the population had been oppressed for 40 years. They felt that they had been denied the fruits of the country. They'd gone through horrific scenes of repression. Tripoli's experience has, in comparison to the East, been milder, and I think that there are those who are going to go where they feel the wind is blowing. They will go with whichever side has the upper hand. If the Transitional National Council can establish itself, I think it quite quickly can win the support of the population. If that remains a long drawn-out process where it isn't clear who's in power, where it looks as if there's internal division, where they haven't really managed to consolidate their control on the capital, many are going to hanker after old times when they knew who was in power.
That was Nicholas Pelham in Tripoli, where the situation remains very unstable. To take a step back and get a sense of the significance of these events for Libya's development in the longer term, we spoke to Daniel Serwer in Washington, D.C. Daniel, what do you see as the threats to this process? What could derail it?
The biggest threat to this process is continued violence. That really makes it very, very difficult to begin the process of state building. It's just more than the weak institutions of the state can handle at the moment. So the sooner they get Gaddafi, the sooner they end the resistance, the better. But then they will face enormous problems after that, everything from keeping the electricity and water flowing to feeding people and trying to ensure that their rights are protected, preventing revenge killing. They have managed reasonably well so far, I think, and in particular, we know from their behavior in the other liberated territories before they got to Tripoli that these people are relatively wise about what they're doing, and the formation of local councils, for example, in the liberated areas is a particularly good sign.
All through the conflict in Libya, there have been questions about sort of who the rebels are, what they are working towards, what kind of Libya they might build. Do we have a better sense of who they are at this stage, or is that still sort of something of an unknown?
It's something of an unknown, but we know a good deal about what they want because they've written it down in a constitutional charter for the interim period. And it's a very good constitutional charter for the interim period. It would make Libya into a more democratic state. It would have Islam as the state religion and Sharia as the principal source of legislation. But what that means in practice is what really counts. I don't see any real sign. Extremism on the religious end is a big problem in the Transitional National Council. And I think it's extremely important that they keep the Islamists inside the tent. Journalists are all describing the TNC as a hodgepodge. Well, hodgepodge is exactly what they need at the moment because they're writing the rules of the game, which is the Constitution. And the Constitution determines how power is distributed in the society, and if you want everybody to accept it, you better have everybody in the tent when you write it.
And how significant do you see the threat from loyalists to Gaddafi or from an elite that is unwilling to relinquish its hold on power or on resources?
The loyalists can't restore the previous regime. There's no threat in that sense. What they can do is just make the transition much more difficult and much lengthier. Former regime elements will hold on to as much power as they possibly can, and it will take years, not months, to uncover them all, to get the property back that they've stolen, and to restore a sense of equity in Libya. You don't do it in one fell swoop. You have to do it iteratively over and over again, probably for the next 5 years or so.
we've been talking about what the rebels can and should be doing, what Libyans should be doing. Outsiders have obviously played a large role in Libya up till now. What do you think they should be doing going forward?
Well, the first thing they should be doing is listening to the Libyans. And they need, in particular, to listen to the Libyans in the formulation of what I think should be a new UN Security Council resolution that lays out goals over the longer term for Libya. And in return for stating those goals clearly, a democratic society under the rule of law with oil and gas wealth distributed broadly to the entire population in a transparent and accountable way, I would suggest that the right quid pro quo for that is unfreezing of the Libyan assets abroad. I don't think the Libyans at this point need all the assets, but they need the confidence that they will be able to get hold of all the assets in due course in order to begin planning the transition process and budgeting for it, which is a difficult and complicated process that they need to begin right away.
And how much credence do you give to the warnings and concerns that Libya could turn into another Iraq?
Well, it's hard to picture another Iraq because you don't have the sectarian differences and the ethnic differences that brought chaos to Iraq for a while. You don't have the massive foreign military presence that engendered the resistance. So it's hard to picture that, but it's easy to picture chaotic and unstable situations. I think if Libya were to head into a downward spiral of violence and chaos, the international community might have to react at Libyan request with some paramilitary police forces or something like that to help keep order, especially in Tripoli. But I don't see that happening yet, and I think we have to avoid it if at all possible.
That was Daniel Serwer of Johns Hopkins University on the line from Washington, D.C., discussing the challenges that Libya faces both now and in the future. In London, this is The Economist.
The Economist.